Good, well, it's good evening for me anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, good to be back with you on these talks on the Wise Snake channel. Today I was going to have a quick chat about the Hyksos mosaic because I think it's quite interesting. It's quite pertinent to my Jesus King of Edessa book. And I liked this discovery because I predicted this discovery before it even happened, which just went to show to me that this Edessa theory, Edessa gospel theory, is predictive. It's actually predicting what will appear in later archaeology. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is actually the cover to my book. So if I do a quick screen share and share a window, we should see the cover of my Edessa book. Now, I made this cover showing the king of Edessa as the biblical Jesus, who was the leader of the Jewish revolt, according to Josephus. We can go into that. This is the leader of the Jewish revolt, and this is the image I put on the front of my book. And you can probably see we've got a king here in Roman armor with a purple cloak. He's got blonde ginger hair and beard and mustache. He's got the crown of thorns on. The one we're going to look at in the mosaic doesn't actually have the crown of thorns, but apart from that, it's the same. It has the diadema headband. You can't see the headband very much on here, but you can see the tassels on the back of his head there. And he's wearing stockings. And yeah, it's quite an iconic sort of image. Well, about 4 years after I made that image, they discovered the Hyksos mosaic. And here is the main image from that. And this Hyksos is just to the north west of Galilee. So it's in modern Israel. It's a synagogue. It's one of these many synagogues that has a zodiac on the floor, which sort of indicates that this should be a Nazarene synagogue because they were slightly different to classical Judaism. And they had this very large, very ornate mosaic on the floor. Unfortunately, most of that has been destroyed, so it's not a very good one to show you. But it had several other mosaics on the floor. One of them is this one, which is the story of Noah, of course. So you got Noah going along in his ship, and he's been thrown into the water, and he's been eaten by these fish monsters, and a fish monster being eaten by a fish monster being eaten by a fish monster, which is interesting. So that's the story of Noah. And then they had this one, which is supposed to be the Tower of Babel. And obviously it does look like the Tower of Babel. I like this drawing because it's very active, animated, you might say. It's got lots of things going on in it. So they're building this tower, which people have interpreted as being the Tower of Babel. They're using a capstan to lift the stones, shows how high the Roman technology was. They're using a pulley system to lift the stones. Bandsaw here to cut some wood. You've got two guys, black guy and a white guy, having a quick fight here, one with a hammer, one with a bandsaw. What else do we have? We've got people climbing ropes. This is obviously dangerous work. We've got people at the top of the we've got a guy here at the top of the tower who's using a plumb line to make sure it's true. So standard plumb line with a weight on the end. And I'm not entirely sure that this is a Tower of Babel. I don't think I've got the other picture. That's a bit of a shame. I'll have to look it up in a minute. I think this is probably actually one of the towers at Palmyra, because this is exactly the sort of towers they used at Palmyra. I'll go and look for one of those images in a minute. But that's not the main reason for looking at this. The main reason is this, which is the Hyksos elephant mosaic, because you can see some elephants on the right-hand side. And this was identified by the chief archaeologist on site, Professor Jody Magnus, as being Alexander the Great with his army, because Alexander the Great did pass through Judea on the way to Egypt when he defeated Egypt. He did call in at the temple and say hello to the priests there, who greeted him, obviously, because he came down with an enormous great army. And he was just passing through, as it were. So we have this from Arrian, who is the biographer of Alexander. But this is not Alexander the Great. Okay, he does have the diadema of a king, which Alexander would have worn, but Alexander's never shown as being hirsute, you might say, with, well, he had long hair, but he's never shown with a mustache and beard. He didn't wear stockings. I don't know if you can see, but his legs are a different color to the priest's legs. This is indicating that he's wearing stockings. Now, the Greeks did not. The Persians did, and so did the Edessans. They all wore stockings. It was an Eastern custom. Alexander was never known for bringing a sacrificial calf. Obviously, the king here, he is a king because he's got the diadema headband on, is bringing a calf as an offering to the high priest. Now, the archaeologists said this was a bull, but obviously, if you look at him, he's a, let me zoom in a little bit. He's a very happy little calf. He's a sacrificial calf, quite obviously. And note that the king is wearing a payot, a Jewish side lock of hair, the same as Jews wear today with their little ringlets down the side of their head. Alexander the Great would never have worn a payot. He was not Alexander the Great Jew. He would not be seen dead with a payot on the side of his head. So we're looking at a Jewish leader here, leader of an army. You can see the army on the right-hand side with war elephants, meeting with the high priest of Jerusalem. Furthermore, I think I've got an image of it here. This army was defeated. So this is the register below the one we were just looking at. And down the bottom here, you can see the army was defeated. The elephants are all on their faces. The horses are, I think there's one of the horses is upside down with his legs in the air. But anyway, this one here, you can see he's got spears in his side and he's bleeding. This is the defeated army. Alexander the Great was obviously never defeated in Judea. Don't be ridiculous. So yeah, this is not Alexander the Great. So what's it talking about? Well, I don't know why the archaeologist in charge and the rest of the team, because there was a big team here. They must have had, a dozen specialists on site who were Jewish historians and Jewish theologians. Have they never read the Talmud? Seems strange to me because I knew exactly what this was talking about, because this was the guy I'd put on the front of my book, the king of Edessa, who was the leader of the Jewish revolt. This is the whole point of this book, that this Edessan king, who I equate with the gospel story, was the leader of the Jewish revolt. And so this guy here is probably the leader of the Jewish revolt. So let's read the Talmud and see what it says about this. So this is from Gittin 55, if you know your Talmud. And it says, and while we're reading this, have a look at the image and see if it concurs with this. Yohanan is writing this. So Yohanan was the high priest after the Jewish revolt. Yohanan ben Zakkai was his name. Yohanan went and said to the emperor, who was Nero at the time, "The Jews are rebelling against you." And Nero said, "How can I tell?" Nero's having a bit of a joke here because the Jews were always rebelling. So how can I tell this is a special rebellion? Yohanan said to him, "Send them an offering and see whether they will offer it on the altar." So Yohanan sent Bar Kamsa, this is Bar Kamsa in the image here, with a fine calf as an offering. And you can see the calf here. While on the way, Bar Kamsa made a blemish on its upper lip. And you can see the blemish here on the lip of the calf. The rabbis at the temple were inclined to offer the calf in order not to offend the government, not to offend Nero. But Rabbi Zechariah Abkulus said to them, "People will say that blemish animals are offered on the altar," which was not allowed, of course. They then proposed to kill Bar Kamsa so he would not go and inform against them. But Rabbi Zechariah said to them, "Is one who makes a blemish on a consecrated animal to be put to death? Can you be sentenced to get death for cutting the lip of a calf?" And so Rabbi Yohanan thereupon remarked, "Through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves have been exiled from our land." Okay, so this is about the Jewish revolt because the house has been destroyed, the temple. Our house has been destroyed. Our temple has been burnt. The temple of Jerusalem was burnt during the Jewish revolt. And we ourselves are exiled from our land, which is exactly what happened because all of the Jews from Jerusalem were exiled by the Romans after the Jewish revolt. Now, this is what this scene is all about. Here is the guy that they call Bar Kamsa, who is offering the fine calf from Emperor Nero to the Jewish revolt, and he cut its lip. I mean, this was a double heresy. This was a calf from a Gentile king or emperor, which shouldn't be allowed anyway. But now he's made it imperfect. It had to be a perfect calf. Now, why did Bar Kamsa do this? Well, because he was stirring up trouble, basically. He wanted the Jerusalem priesthood to reject this calf in order to sour relations between Rome and the Judean priesthood. He was stirring up trouble. He wanted the Jewish revolt. And what better way to start it than to sour relations with Rome so that the Roman authorities would have to act against Rome, or Rome act against the Jewish authorities, because they've just sent back this sacrificial calf from Emperor Nero, angering Nero. Nero might declare war on Judea. That was the whole idea. So this dates this mosaic to about AD 65, just before the Jewish revolt. And we know who the leaders of the Jewish revolt were. They were let me have a quick look. So here's a quick quote from you, from Josephus. So about the beginning of the Jewish revolt. Who were the leaders of the Jewish revolt? Actually, before we do this, I might as well just stop the screen share for a little bit. So I will stop sharing and I should come back. There we go. So who started the Jewish revolt? Now, this is not actually very well known, because if you look this up in any classical history book or in any religious book, nobody will really tell you. Even Wiki is utterly confused about who started the Jewish revolt. But it's quite clear from the works of Josephus that this was started by the princes and kings of Edessa ad Diabene. So what does Josephus say? Well, in War 219, he says, at the outbreak of the Jewish revolt, he says, the most valiant in the battle with Cestius were the kinsmen of Monobazus, king of Adiabene, and their names were Monobazus and Kenadius. Okay, that probably needs explaining a little bit. So the battle against Cestius was really the start of the Jewish revolt. This is when a legion, a Syrian legion, Roman legion, went down to Judea to put down some local troubles, because they were having a bit of a revolt down there. So the Roman legion went down to Jerusalem. They got caught out in fighting. They made a retreat, and the retreat turned into a rout. And the Jewish army, as it wasn't much of an army. It was more of a rabble than an army. Defeated the Romans and wiped out a whole legion. Now, you don't do that to Rome and get away with it. That really was the start of the Jewish revolt, when a legion of Rome was destroyed. So who did it? Well, this was Monobazus and Kenadius of the Adiabene, as Josephus likes to call them. But who were the Adiabenans? Well, the queen of Adiabene was the famous Queen Helena, and she was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. Okay, so now we've got an idea. The war was started by the king and his princes of Edessa. And that's why Edessa is so important in this story, but gets left out of most history books, unfortunately, so people don't know this. And they were the last to surrender at the end of the Jewish revolt. So this was in AD 70. And Josephus says about this in War 6:6, he says, on the same day it was that the sons and brethren of King Izates besought Caesar to give them his right hand for their security. Even though Caesar was very angry at them, he not lay aside his old moderation, but received them. He kept them all in jail, and then bound the king's sons and kingsmen and led them with him to Rome, in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans. And this probably needs explaining as well. So who was King Izates? Well, King Izates was King Esus, because his nickname was Issa or Isus, which is the name still given to Jesus, of course, in the Arabias. So this was King Izates. He was a king of Adiabene, but Adiabene is Edessa, as we know, because the queen of Adiabene was married to the king of Edessa. So at the end of the war, he's going to Caesar, who would actually, at that point, the throne of Rome was empty at that point, but it was very shortly going to be Emperor Vespasian. And So it's saying that Caesar received them. It's probably actually talking about Titus here, actually, who was the son of Vespasian, because he was continuing the war while Vespasian was down in Alexandria. So he kept them all in jail and led them and bound the king's sons and kingsmen and led them with him to Rome. So they were in chains being led to Rome as hostages. Now, there are a couple of historians out there who seem to, I don't know, have a brain fart or something, who say that therefore, because they are being put in chains and led off into jail, this makes them allies of Rome, which I really don't understand. Because Caesar didn't kill them and he gave them his right hand for their security, they say, therefore, they must have been allies of Rome. No, absolute nonsense. They were the enemy. But sometimes it's not worth killing your enemy. There's no point in having a hostage if your hostage is dead. So it's better to keep them alive. And then you've got, as it says here, a hostage for their country's fidelity to the Romans. You can then go to their country and say, look, we have your king. Behave yourself. Don't start another Jewish revolt. Otherwise, we'll kill your king. We did exactly the same to Napoleon Bonaparte in the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, twice, no less. So after the first wars with Napoleon, Britain sent him down to Elba. Rather than killing him, we wanted a hostage, and so we sent him to Elba, which was probably a mistake because it was not far enough from from France. And so with some supporters, he managed to escape and start a second war. And that second war ended at the Battle of Waterloo, where he was soundly trounced by a combination of British forces and the Prussians. And so we captured him again. And this time, again, we didn't kill him. We bound him and led him with us to the island of St. Helena in order to keep him as a hostage for his country's fidelity to the Britons and the Prussians. So again, we did not kill Bonaparte. He was sent to St. Helena, which is way down in the South Atlantic. And because Britain ruled the seas at those times, there was no way that he was going to escape from St. Helena. It's way down in the South Atlantic. So yeah, countries do this. Nations do this. Kings and rulers do this. It's not always worth killing your enemy. It's better to keep them as a hostage. So these historians who say that the Edessan Adiabanites and Rome were allies are completely and utterly mistaken. So yeah, that's the story of the Edessans starting the Jewish revolt, failing, of course, because they lost the Jewish revolt, and being taken by the Romans into Rome. So what happened? Well, we drop off the edge of history in a way here, and we end up in the world of mythology and speculation. But there is an argument to be made that these rebels, who I believe included the biblical Jesus, ended up in Britain. So what happened after this point? Well, Vespasian was down in Alexandria at the time, and the war was being prosecuted by his son, Titus. So Vespasian was in Alexandria, to take the produce of Egypt, because Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. So he had stopped all exports. going to Rome in order to have a hold over Rome, because he wanted to become emperor, and he was deciding whether to try and become emperor, because Vespasian was a nobody. He was not aristocratic. He was not of the family of Caesar. What would make him be able to take over the throne of Rome? What he wanted was an oracle, and his supporters provided that oracle. And that oracle was a certain man. So who was this certain man? So this comes from Suetonius, I think. Yeah, a certain man from the common people, who had lost his sight, and likewise with another with a crippled leg, approached him together while he was sitting in front of the tribunal in Alexandria. Vespasian would, they have been told, make their eyes better if he spat on them, and would heal the leg if he touched it with his heel. Vespasian could hardly believe that this enterprise would in any way be successful. But finally, when his friends were openly urging him on in front of the crowd, he attempted both, and the results did not let him down. So Vespasian was looking for an oracle that would allow him to become the next emperor. He wanted the backing of the gods, basically, and there's no better way of getting the backing of the gods than proving a miracle, like restoring someone's sight and mending their legs. But of course, this restoring of the sight was exactly the same as Jesus did, by spitting in the person's eyes to restore his sight. Vespasian was sort of becoming the new Jesus. And blind man and a crippled leg, we could be talking about crucifixion wounds here. And it goes on to say that this person shouldn't really have been there. Why shouldn't he have been there? Well, he was supposed to be dead, of course. The verse about Jesus says very much the same thing. It says, "And Jesus took the blind man, and when he had spat in his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked if he could see anything. And Jesus put his hands upon the eyes and made the man look up, and his sight was restored." So there you go. That was the miracle of Jesus. And Vespasian had just performed the same miracle as Jesus did. Interesting, isn't it? What I think was going on here, and I'm not going to go through this because it's quite long. He also sees a man called Basilides, who appeared to Vespasian in the temple of Serapis. And people have written about this. And one of the historians says of this meeting, "We find Basilides appearing to Vespasian in the temple of Serapis under circumstances that cannot fail to remind us of Christ's suddenly standing in the midst of his disciples when the doors were shut. This incident again has very much the appearance of a parody on the gospel story." So we've had 2 or 3 parables on the parodies, I should say, on the gospel story. Why are they doing this? Well, because I think that Vespasian wanted to be the new Jesus. Remember, the star prophecy in this era was that a star from the east would become the next emperor of Rome. And who was born under the eastern star? That was Jesus, of course. But Josephus had bestowed the star prophecy upon Vespasian, saying, "Vespasian, you are in the east, therefore you must be the star from the east, and therefore you must be the next emperor of Rome." So Vespasian was even stealing the star prophecy from Jesus in order that he could become the next emperor of Rome. Okay, so what happened then? Well, I think they did exactly the same as Britain did to Napoleon, and they sent him into exile. But where do you send this dangerous rebel? Because we're now saying that Jesus was the leader of the Jewish revolt. He was King Ejected Manu of Edessa, the guy who led the Jewish revolt, who had now just lost to Vespasian. So in the Bible, he's called King Jesus Emmanuel, and in the historical record, he's called King Ejected Manu, the sixth of Adiabene and Edessa. I think they packed him off into a prison. And where do you put that prison? Well, same as Britain did with Napoleon, as far as you possibly can from his position of power. So we sent Napoleon all the way down into the South Atlantic to keep him as far from France as possible. And the Romans, if we just do a quick share screen, so that should be coming up with a share. So then we have a share screen. Okay, where in the Roman Empire, this is a map of the first century Roman Empire, where is as far as you can get from Judea in the Roman Empire in the first century? Well, if we track across the Roman Empire, we end up at northwest Britain. That's as far as you can get from Judea. And I think that's exactly what happened, because Emperor Vespasian built this, which is Fortress Diva. Or Diva. The Romans would have pronounced it as Diva. And this is not only in Britain, this is in Chester on the northwest coast of Britain. So in the furthest northwest that you could possibly get in the Roman Empire. And this fortress has caused a lot of consternation because nobody knows why it's built there. It was not built in a strategic position in order to take over Britain. It was not on a major roadway. It was out of the way, right out on the west coast, in modern Chester, in Cheshire. And it was the biggest fortress in the Roman Empire, just about. Yeah, I think it was the largest. And it had some funny elements in it. So it had down here an extra accommodation block. So these are the accommodation blocks, top and bottom. But it had an extra accommodation block in the middle with this extra courtyard, an extra bathhouse. No other Roman fortress had two bathhouses. Here's the other one down the bottom. So it had a smaller one up the top. And it had a temple. No other Roman fortress had a temple in it because it's not necessary for the running of a fortress to have a temple. So this is a very strange fortress. Nobody can quite explain why it's there and why it's so large and obviously so important and why it has this big temple in the middle of it. I think the answer is obvious. This is Guantanamo Bay of the first century. So just the same as America did in forming Guantanamo Bay, just the same as Britain did with Napoleon. You put a fortress to house these rebels in a remote location. And that's exactly what Vespasian did, because this fortress was made in AD 72, immediately after the Jewish revolt. And that's the reason I think he made it, because this was a prison fortress. This was a Guantanamo Bay. And it's still there. Here's the wall. This is the north wall of the fortress. Down the bottom here, the Victorians cut a canal. This is a canal that goes along the bottom. That's obviously not original, but this wall is original. This is rebuilt on the top, but the bottom wall here is original. So that was a bit unusual as well. This is a stone fortress. It's not a wooden one. It's a stone fortress. And the giveaway that this is a peculiar fortress is this temple. So this is the temple in the fortress. I call it a temple of the zodiac. We'll see why in a minute. But it's also a temple of the Vesica Piscis. The almond sort of shape that is linked to Pisces. It's linked to fish, but it really denotes the ecliptic circle and the celestial circle in the heavens above. So how do you create one of these? Well, this is a Vesica Piscis. And people have read my book and say, that's not a Vesica Piscis, it's the wrong size. Well, you can make a Vesica Piscis whatever shape you want if you really want. So on the right is the proper Vesica Piscis, which is formed of two circles where they touch at each other's center. So you end up with half a circle, half a circle, half a circle. That's a true Vesica Piscis, and that's pretty much what you see in the heavens above between the celestial circle and the ecliptic circle. But you end up with a very, very small temple if you do it like that. Not very practical. So much better if you push the two circles together a bit. And so instead of having halves, you have quarters. And you have quarter, 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 quarter. Push them together a bit, and you end up with a fatter Vesica Piscis, and therefore a much more usable temple. And that's exactly what we find with the Fortress Diwa temple. It's actually made as quarters. So here it is. So someone has made two layout circles to actually create the temple. They've laid out these big circles and then drawn the temple in the middle. And it's based on quarter circles all the way down. So it is a Vesica Piscis. Now, who was identified with a Vesica Piscis? Who would want a temple of this nature? A temple with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 alcoves denoting the signs of the zodiac. So this is a temple of the zodiac as well. So who was symbolized by the Vesica Piscis? Well, it was Jesus, of course, wasn't it? Very often you will find Jesus inside a Vesica Piscis because it is sometimes denoted as being the sign of Pisces. And of course, Jesus was the first of the fisher kings, which is why the symbol of Christianity became the ichthus fish. We'll see some other evidence of that in a minute. I thought it was on this line, but it's not. So yes, this sort of temple would be linked, intimately linked with Jesus and the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James, which is why I think this leader of the Jewish revolt was incarcerated here, because the guy was the biblical Jesus, and he spent the remainder of his life in Fortress Diva, or Fortress Diva. Interestingly, the dimensions of these circles, that's probably not the best one, let's do this one. The dimensions of these circles remained a mystery to archaeologists and historians. Why? Well, because they don't understand this history, because these layout circles are not made in Roman units, nor are they made in Greek units, and so nobody knows why they were made this size. But that's because they don't know this history. These layout circles are made in Egyptian royal cubits. Now, who would be using Egyptian cubits? Yes, that would be the Nazarene Jews, of course, because they came out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I have called my son. If you look in the Old Testament, it clearly says that the Ark of the Covenant was made by using the royal cubit of Egypt. It was a cubit and a hand breadth, which is the royal cubit. So yes, the Jesus character would indeed have used Egyptian royal cubits for this construction. And this is what it looked like inside. Artist impression, of course, but this was quite sumptuous. In fact, it's been said that at this time, because this is only AD 72, Britain was only taken over by Rome in AD 43. So this is very, very soon after the the second invasion of Britain. This was the finest building in the whole of Britain at this time. Someone spent an awful lot of money on this temple, and it even had this fountain in the middle. We know it had a fountain because they found the lead piping that went to the center of the temple. And this took a lot of money to get this because they had to have pressurized water. How did they get pressurized water? Well, they dammed a spring, or rather they covered a spring, which was 2 or 3 kilometers away. And by damming the spring, you can get pressure out of the spring. And then they piped it underground all the way down to the fortress, which was, I say, about at least 2 kilometers away, with pipes all the way into the center of the fortress. So they had pressurized water for the fountain. All very clever. And this is what it looked like from the outside. Artist's impression, of course. So they think the center was open to the skies, which would be essential if this was a Sabaean cult, a cult of astronomer priests looking at the heavens above. So here's the temple, here's the separate bathhouse. Now, who would need separate bathhouses? Who would not bathe with Romans? Yes, that would be the Jews, of course, and especially if they were being held as prisoners. That's why it has a separate bathhouse. This is the temple today, and unfortunately, they've built a shopping center on the top, on the top of it. So any further archaeology has rather been scuppered here. I did hope that the archaeology would still be present underneath, but underneath this shopping center, they have built a underground car park. So there's no chance of finding any further archaeology. All of the material has been grubbed up. They obviously did this archaeological investigation while this shopping center was being built, but they didn't go through the whole of this site. They just put trenches across it. So there was like 4 trenches went across this temple. That's how they got the dimensions of it. but the rest of it eventually was just grubbed up and thrown away. And we don't know where they put the spoils. So I don't know what happened to all that, because some of the archaeology could still be in that spoil heap, where whatever happened to that spoil heap. But unfortunately, we don't know where that is. And that might have included this, which is the, they call it the Old Hall inscription. This was an inscription that sat at the very center of this fortress. And it's a very fine piece of sculpture, piece of stonework. And we don't know fully what it said, which is unfortunate because most of it is missing. And so we've had various guesstimates about what it might have once said. So we've only got snippets, of course, of each word, and we don't know what the words were on either side. But the words we do have might give you a flavor of what this was about. So my two translations, line by line, are, because there's only two words identifiable on each line, and you have to make up the rest. Submit divine, fortress judge, amicable end, against the government, this entrance granted. And another possible interpretation is under heaven, fortress anyone, honorable conclusion, against the government, this entrance permission. It's, I don't know, to me that seems to give elements of magnanimity towards someone who has been against the government, but now permission has been granted, honorable conclusion, amicable end to the hostilities. I think this is talking about the Jewish revolt. And this is the amicable end to that war, that these people are now incarcerated in this fortress, miles away from, thousands of miles away from their homeland. And it's a sort of warning to the soldiers who are guarding it. Don't try and kill these people, because this is the honorable end to this something that was against the government, the Jewish revolt. We don't know, but that's my sort of idea. So one last thing about this fortress is it has a peculiar conclusion, because okay, this temple was built in AD 72. It was destroyed at the turn of the first century. Call it AD 98, 99 or something. It was destroyed. They pulled it down. Why did they do that? I think it was because all of the people who had been incarcerated here, the prisoners, had all died. So there was no need for this temple anymore. So they pulled it down. But then But then 200 years later, 225 years, no, 100, what am I saying? 125 years later, in AD 220s, they rebuilt it. And this is the second temple of the zodiac in the same fortress. So why did they rebuild it? Well, let's have a look at the new temple first, because it's on the same floor plan as the first one, but it's a slightly different shape. What they've done again is they've pushed these planning circles closer together again to make the temple even fatter and therefore more usable. Again, it has 12 compartments inside it. So it is a temple of the zodiac, but now it's done on sevenths. 1/7, 2.5 sevenths, 1/7, 2.5, 1/7. They've pushed them closer together again. And the layout circles are now 80 Egyptian cubits instead of 70 Egyptian cubits. So again, it's being made in the Egyptian measurement system. So they rebuilt it. Why on earth did they do that? Well, we know that they rebuilt it in about the 220s because they found a coin of Elagabalus underneath one of the flagstones. And that's interesting because Elagabalus was the new Jesus. He was from the same region. He came from Emesa instead of Edessa. He was a priest of the Elagabal stone, and we think Jesus was as well. That's why his primary disciple was called Peter, the stone. That's why he had that title. And just as Jesus was talking about his disciples becoming eunuchs, so did Elagabalus. So in Matthew 19:12, Jesus says, "For there are some eunuchs who were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs by men. And there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." So Jesus is clearly saying to his disciples here, if you can castrate yourself for the kingdom of heaven's sake, then you should do so. Why would he say that? Well, because this is the cult of Kibel and Attis, and all of the priests of Attis were castrated, just as Attis was castrated. So the priests of the Elagabal stone had to be castrated. They were eunuchs. And it's possible even that Jesus in later days was a eunuch himself, because the Fisher King, remember Jesus was the first of the Fisher Kings, the Fisher Kings in Arthurian legend were also the wounded kings who were castrated. They were wounded between the thighs. They were the castrated kings because they also venerated the sacred stone, the same Elagabal stone. And Emperor Elagabalus was the priest of the Elagabal stone. That's why he castrated himself. Now, his regime, he became emperor, but he didn't last more than about 4 or 5 years, and he was deposed. Now, they say that he was killed. Maybe he wasn't, but even if he was killed, you have his whole administration, who the Romans did not like. I rather get the impression he probably wasn't killed. But again, what do you do with one of these Eastern emperors who is greatly disliked by Rome? And you don't necessarily want to kill them because, well, these emperors are very powerful and they have the ear of the gods, of course. Some of them even claimed to be gods themselves. Well, you send them into exile, don't you? And so just as the leaders of the Jewish revolt were sent into exile, I think Elagabalus was as well. And to this very same fortress. And because he venerated the zodiac and because he venerated the sacred Elagabal stone, they built this same temple exactly as they did in AD 72, and they rebuilt this temple in the AD 220s, and I think it was to hold Elagabalus and his regime in this fortress as a prisoner of Rome. And that's why this temple was rebuilt. That's why there was a coin of Elagabalus underneath this temple. So that is the story. Oh, and here is this is what the disciples of Jesus would have looked like. This comes from the works of Josephus, who talks about this. He says that they dressed in women's clothing. So what does Josephus say about this? Because we get this from the Gospels, of course. Jesus has asked his disciples to castrate themselves. Josephus weighs in. Well, Lucian weighs in before this, because this was well known, this cult of castration in the East, and the Romans didn't really like it, actually, so they sort of made fun of it. So Lucian says, on these days men become the Galli. And remember, Jesus was a Galilean, he was a Galli. That's why he was, it's not because he lived in Galilee. He was called a Galilean because he was a Galli priest of the Elagabal stone. On these days, men become Galli, for while the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many. He throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout, and takes up a sword, which I believe stood there for this purpose. He grabs it and immediately castrates himself. Then he rushes through the city, holding his testicles in his hands, and he takes female clothing and women's adornments from whichever house he throws these testicles into. So these were the testicle tossers of Syria, the Galilee, or the Galileans of Syria and Judea. And Jesus was a Galilean, of course, so was Peter. And Peter was only recognized because of his voice. What was wrong with his voice? Was this an accent, or did he have a high voice? I would suggest he had a high voice. And Josephus weighs in on this, and talking about the Jewish revolt and the people who were revolting against Rome and revolting against the Jewish authorities, he calls them Galileans. And remember, Jesus was a Galilean. And he says, the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments, and were smeared with ointments that they might appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes, and intimated not only the ornaments, but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely decked cloaks and dresses, and ran everybody through whom they came upon. Josephus War 4:9. So the Galileans wore women's clothing and women's makeup, and they would have looked like this. And funnily enough, these are the Hijra of India, and funnily enough, they're wearing the the crown of Kibel, because the Galileans, they venerated Kibel, and for some reason these Indians are still wearing the crown of Kibel. But anyway, so Jesus and his disciples would have looked like this. The only difference would be that they would have a sword or a dagger underneath their dresses. And people say that's crazy, but I don't have a picture here. But if you go to Rome and you watch a conclave of bishops coming into the Vatican, all of the bishops are wearing women's clothing, red dresses. So this same tradition is still here even today. I wonder if I've got an image. I'm sure I've got an image. It might just take a while to bring it up. Now it's being very slow for some reason and not bringing it up. Ah, here we go. No, can't find it. Anyway, I'm sure if you go online and have a look for bishop in a red cassock, you'll be able to see that the Catholic priests still dress in women's clothing. So we'll just do a quick leave studio. Sorry, stop share. And we're back again. Okay, so I hope you found that interesting. I don't know if there's any questions from the floor on that. I'm going to have to stop.
There we go. All right, now I can start. Now I can ask you questions and edit it. Yeah. It was very interesting. I mean, it's always interesting. But the thing is the was he the son of the king of Edessa? I mean, that's a question. Jesus, was he? He was. That's what I want to know.
Yeah. So father and son. So the father would have been King Abgarus Okama of Edessa and Adiabene. He was king up until AD 50, we think, maybe early 50s. So he was the king that was involved in sending the famine relief money down to Judea, which we talked about previously. So he gets a quick appearance in Acts of the Apostles. So he died in the early AD 50s. And then the next king was Manu the fifth, who I think was actually probably the James character, but he died. There's quite a lot of evidence that James died in the early AD 60s. Some equate him with Stephen in Acts of the Apostles because Stephen just means the crowned one. And so he was stoned in that one. There's other traditions from the Clementines that he was thrown off the temple steps. And there's also a tradition that it was Saul who beat him to death with a fuller's club. Now that's a very old tradition, doesn't have much to back it up. But of course, if you look in Acts of the Apostles, it pointedly says that Saul was standing by a pile of clothes while Stephen or James was being stoned. Why is he standing by a pile of clothes? Well, because that's what a fuller's club is used for. It's used for beating clothes. So it's quite possible that Saul actually beat James to death. And so the next, yeah.
Oh no, I said that's
interesting. Yeah, they don't teach that in some. Yeah, they don't teach that in Sunday school.
No, they don't. One thing, the king of Edessa had written a letter to Caesar. Are you I know you know all about that. About why did they kill Jesus? You know what that letter was called, or?
Yeah, there's various records of these letters. The main one is Jesus writing to the king of Edessa, and that's contained in the Doctrine of Addai. Very well worth reading. It's available online. The letters themselves are later Christian interpolations, but the the circumstances surrounding it are probably true, because we have this story in 3 different works. In Acts of the Apostles, it's known as the Council of Jerusalem. It's the same as the doctrine of Addai. But yes, there are other traditions that said that they wrote to Caesar saying, the Jews are being terrible to the Jesus character. What are you going to do about it? And so on. Those letters are probably apocryphal, but they do link Edessa in to this story, which the Gospels, of course, fail to do, which Josephus fails to do, unless you can understand that Adiabeni is actually Edessa. They are trying to distance Edessa from this story, because Edessa was too closely linked to this story. And Rome didn't want you to know that. Rome did not want you to know that you could rebel against Rome. And the later Catholic Church didn't want you to know that, because they didn't want you to know that Jesus was a prince and a king of Edessa. So yes, Jesus would have been King Esus Manu VI, who probably became king in the early AD 60s when Manu V died, when James died. And then he became king, and then he led the Jewish revolt, and he lost the Jewish revolt. He didn't die then. He was taken into custody, put in prison, put in this Guantanamo Bay, and then he would have died in the AD 90s, something of that nature, at quite an old age, in this prison fortress.
Are you familiar with the book, The Egyptian, I think it's called, by Lena Einhorn?
Yes, yeah. She has, somewhere I have her graph, which is a very good graph, which shows a lot of this. I'm not sure if I've got it readily available. But yes, she, because I wrote about this back in 1997, so a long time ago, and she has used some of that material, and she put it in graphical form, and it looks fairly convincing. What she was trying to prove was that there was a duplication of this story. So the actual story took place in the AD 60s and AD 70. But the Romans shunted this story back into the AD 20s and 30s, because they didn't want anyone to know that you could rebel against Rome. We talked about this in the King Jesus talk we did before. And that's why you end up with this duplication of very, very similar events.
Yeah.
So she has a...
I'm
yep,
sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. The Jews in the Talmud, they pushed the Jesus character in their Talmud back before Jesus, because if they'd have said, "Hey, it happened AD," then they would have been dangerous to them to say that, because the Christians would have probably done some bad things to them. But that's kind of strange, because back then they would shift things to backwards and forwards to whatever they wanted to, whatever pleased them.
Yeah, well, a lot of this was to save their skin. There was a good reason for doing this. The Jews didn't want to fall foul of Rome, because remember, they'd just lost the Jewish revolt. They had been exiled from their lands. They could not write about this. Rome forbade people to write about the true reasons of the Jewish revolt. So they had to write it in code, and they weren't allowed to write about Jesus being the leader of the Jewish revolt. So again, they wrote it in code. So in that quote that we looked at about the Hyksos mosaic with the king and the sacrificial calf, they call him Bar Kamsa. And you've got to ask yourself, well, why that name? Well, Kamsa in Aramaic means locust. Now, if you go into Acts of the Apostles, we were talking about this before. Acts of the Apostles has King Abgarus as King Agabus. Agabus. Why? Because Agabus means the locust. So the Talmud is doing exactly the same as Acts of the Apostles. It's calling the Edessan king the locust. Why did they do that? Well, it's because they regarded the Edessan royalty as being the same as the locusts in the plagues. So the locusts in the plagues, they came out of the east, they destroyed the land and sent the Jews on an exodus. Well, the Edessans did exactly the same. They came out of the east, they caused destruction in Judea and sent all of the Jews on an exodus, the great exodus out of Judea after they lost the Jewish revolt. And so they were no better than locusts. And that's why they used this alternate name. So in Acts of the Apostles, they call him Agabus, and in the Talmud, they call him Kamsa. So remember, in the Talmud, they have a Kamsa and a Bar Kamsa, a father called Kamsa and a son called Bar Kamsa, the son of Kamsa. So they even have the generations correct, because Kamsa would have died in about early AD 50s. That was King Abgarus of Edessa, died in the AD 50s, and then his son took over. He was Bar Kamsa. He was the son of the locust.
Let me tell you, that's a fantastic research. I mean, it's you just followed the threads. I mean, it looks like you got the clues and you follow the threads and you continue with it.
The thing I like about this, people say you can't do this one, you can't just translate things like this. This is not one translation. This is 4 translations. So we've already seen 2, but the Romans call these Adiabenans, they call them Arabs. But they weren't Arab at all. They came out of Persia. So why do they call them Arabs? Well, because Arab means locust. In Greek, I think it is. And then if you read the Toledoth Yeshu, Jesus gets into trouble and he's tried before Queen Helena of Edessa. So the judge is not Pontius Pilate. The judge is Queen Helena of Edessa, which shows you, that Edessa is involved in this. And then they crucify him on a carob tree. Why on a carob tree? Well, because a carob is a locust. So he was crucified on a locust tree. So we have 4, at the very least, we have 4 indicators from different texts in different languages that all point towards the Edessans being known as locusts.
Could it be that Pontius Pilate's wife, it's always has significance? She's always like she's a part of what's going on. Could that be Helena? I mean, that's why they have the woman in there. They made her important.
It's too early. I think they've pushed, and there's many reasons for thinking they've pushed this story back by 40 years. So I think the Queen Helena is, although she would have been around in that sort of time, the only part of the gospel story that links this with the AD 20s and AD 30 is the mention of Pontius Pilate. And I think they've just changed the name of the governor to make it fit. But a lot of the other things in the gospel story don't fit, as we talked about in the previous talk about the New Testament. There's a lot of indicators in the New Testament which point towards the AD 60s.
Because Felix would be the governor in the 60s, right?
Yeah, I think it was.
Okay, yeah.
It's either Felix or Festus, one of the 2.
Yeah. How about what are your thoughts on? I mean, this is on Simon the sorcerer, Simon Magus, Simon of Samaria. Who do you think he is?
Well, some people say that he is linked to Saul. Do they say? I think some people say he's linked to Saul. I don't think that's true. If you read the Clementines, they have this conference up in Caesarea, quite a famous conference. And that conference is between Simon Magus and Peter. And in the notes, it says that Saul was on the side of Peter because they were the apostles to the Gentiles, whereas Simon Magus was not. He was very firmly of the Nazarene creed, I think, because, you know, a lot of the people said he was the same as Jesus, but he used magic instead of using miracles. So I think Simon Magus was not on the Gentile side, nothing to do with Saul and Peter. He was on the Nazarene side of Jesus and James. So who was he? I think we could probably equate him with Simon Boethus. And Simon Boethus was the father of Mary Magdalene. Not sure if we went through that, but anyway, Simon Boethus was one of the richest men in Judea and one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt. And according to the Talmud and Professor Robert Eisenman, his daughters were Mary and Martha of Bethany, Mary Magdalene. Yep.
When you say Mary Magdalene, in the 12th homily, I believe it is, if you look that up, it says that she was forgiven by the Pope for her sex magic. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, they had a pardon recently. I don't think she was anything to do. Well, she might have been doing something like that because they probably venerated the Hyksos Gamos, the sacred marriage, and so they might have had a sacred priestess who was, as it were, a prostitute of the gods. Because if you go back into Egypt, Atum was one of the great gods of Egypt, and Atum had his magic phallus, from which the world was created. But in order to allow him to ejaculate, he needed a priestess. And so that was one of the jobs of the priestess, part of the Hyksos Gamos, the sacred marriage. And so they may well have had, if they were practicing Egyptian rites instead of more Judaic rites, they may well have had some sort of ceremonies of that nature where the god was caressed in order so that he could ejaculate. Later churches would have regarded that as being very heretical, of course. Because they had rejected all of that Egyptian content of early Judaism. But early Judaism would have had content of that nature. Remember, the Israelite god was called the Aton, the Ardon, which is the Ardon or the Aton god of Pharaoh Akhenaten. They were closely connected. And of course, if you read the Golden Legend, and various other texts, the Protovangelium of James, for instance, Mary, this would have been Mary the mother, was a temple priestess. So yes, of course, she would have been a virgin because she was a Vestal virgin in the temple. They would have had Vestal virgins the same as they did in Rome. And she was a Vestal. She was put there when I think she was about 3 years old or something, very young. And she was a virgin in the temple until she came of age. So we don't know what age that was. Let's call it 16 or something, when she left the temple and went to marry, as they say, with Joseph. So yes, she was a virgin in the temple who went and married Joseph.
Wow. Yeah, because Mary Magdalene, just really interesting person. I mean,
well, if she was Mary Boethus, because her father was, remember that Bethany sisters lived at the house of Simon. This is one of the reasons why Professor Eisenman says that the Bethany sisters were the daughters of Simon Boethus. But he was the richest man in Judea. So Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, when she married, she had a dowry of 1 million gold denarii. That was just
Wow,
her dowry. Now, in today's money, that's worth about $26 billion.
man.
It puts a different spin on it, doesn't it? When you suddenly realize that these were very influential and wealthy people. These were the aristocrats and the monarchy of these regions. They had tremendous wealth.
It's a puzzle, and it sounds like you're putting it together. I mean, that's it. You got it.
Well, it
It's
would make sense, of course, if Jesus was a prince of Edessa, that Mary Magdalene would be someone equivalent.
hmm,
And yeah, but I mean, things like the Golden Legends say exactly the same. So this is not entirely new. Back in the medieval era, they said that Mary Magdalene was a princess who owned 2 castles.
wow.
So they were saying exactly the same back in the medieval era.
Hmm.
And what else did they say? Martha also owned a castle, and Lazarus, who's their brother, he owned, I think it was, it says a better part of the city of Jerusalem was owned by Lazarus. You can imagine someone who owned 30% of Jerusalem, you know.
Yeah, it's. I didn't know that. I mean, I've been reading your books and learn and here's the thing. You know, they and some people reject it, some people accept it, but it's a great perspective. I mean, it's new, and it and in 50 years from now, 100 years, you know, like that, it'll probably people come around and say, hey, this guy was right. You know, I mean, that's
I think they will, because like with the Hyksos mosaic, which was discovered after my book was written, more and more material is coming out. And time again, that material seems to back up what I've actually claimed in my books. So my books are becoming prophetic. The
mm,
material that's being excavated supports my hypothesis. So yeah, I'm confident that it will stand the test of time.
yeah, they'll be doing movies.
Well, it would be very nice, even as a fictional movie. It would be very interesting, you know, as a Dan Brown sort of movie. Um, because like the Dan Brown movie, you might not believe it that much, but everything that's said can be tied back into some sort of historical book. So the narrative he's woven is his own sort of construction, but it's all based on elements of history. Well,
Mm,
mine is exactly the same. Um, my new Odessa theory is the theory I've woven, but it's all firmly based on all of the original texts, whether that's the Talmud, um, the Gospel story, the Romans, all of the books that are available on these topics. It all comes from original material.
I I tell you what, people send me emails requesting you constantly now, and it's you've got a lot of fans and a lot of people that stick up for you, and they they asked in an email, one of your fans wants to appear on a show with you, and I said, well, let me talk to Ralph and see if that would be possible. And he said,
Well, we'll see. Or we could just do a Q&A session and just ask the questions, because obviously I don't know who this character is, and I do get some um, I get some good questions, and I get some bizarre questions, and I get some characters. So it would be nice to know who it is, and what the questions, what the style of the questions are.
oh, definitely, definitely, it's awesome. I mean, your show here, like I asked you, run a series, a show here, and then we can do a call in, a text, you know, everything. And people have a lot of questions. I have a lot more questions, but I don't want to. You sound like your throat's a little sore or hoarse there, and I
It's
don't want to
still,
keep you on.
it's getting worse and worse today. I don't know why. I had a cold a week ago, and it's still not quite gone. And
Hmm.
it seems to be just a common cold. I don't think it's anything different. But the sore throat has stayed on for about 8 days now. Bye.